Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Corey Thornton. I'm the Managing Editor for Market Intelligence at Open Minds. Today, as part of our weekly Executive Web Forum series, Open Minds Senior Associate Margaret Mays will moderate the discussion, Making Value-Based Reimbursement Work, Best Practices in Program Design and Management, featuring Ashley Gibson, Director of Payer Relations for Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, and Donna Esposito, Director of Payer Relations for Thrive Detect. Before we get started, I have a couple announcements. First, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Qualifax Plus Credible, for helping us bring you today's great content. Second, while your audio will be muted today, we are prepared to make this an interactive session. If you have questions at any time during today's web forum, please ask them in the GoToWebinar question box. And third and finally, the slides and recording for today's briefing will be available on the Open Minds website starting tomorrow. And with that, here's Margaret.
Thank you, Corey. I am so excited to monitor this session. This is going to be just a great interactive session. I just know it. Next slide, please. Corey. Thank you. So everybody knows that moving to value-based contracting, it's going to be here. It will come. And even though it's going to take some time, I think it's very important that we sit down and we talk about some of the critical points of collaboration between provider organizations and payers, and get some insight on some of the experience that they have had, some of the challenges that they have had, and talk a little bit about what the future holds when it comes to best practices, program designs, and management. Next slide, please, Corey. So I'm going to turn this over to Ashley and let her talk a little bit about herself. Ashley represents, of course, the provider bucket, if you would, for today's conversation, and then Donna will talk from a payer perspective. So Ashley, take it away.
Thank you, Margaret. Hi and good afternoon. My name is Ashley Gibson. I am the Director of Payer Relations, Contracts, and Utilization Management for Hazelden Betty Ford. I actually started with Hazelden Betty Ford back in 2006, working as a master's level clinician in our substance use counseling program. Shortly into my career, I really piqued an interest with regards to how we work with payers and took a large liking to the work that we were doing behind the scenes to help folks get access to care and utilization of their benefits. I had a brief period of time that I moved over to the insurance side of things. I worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, and then came back to the organization at Hazelden Betty Ford about 11 years ago, overseeing our utilization team, and then moving on to our payer relations and contracting team over the last couple of years. So that's just a little bit about myself and why I'm here today. And if we can advance the slide, that would be great. So one of the things that we really want to be able to talk about, and we'll get more into as we have the roundtable, is really understanding what our experience has been. We have been, as Hazelden Betty Ford, we've been delivering substance use services for the last 70 years. And when I started with the organization in 2006, we were really very much still a self-pay model. We had very few payer contracts. We weren't working with a ton of insurance companies at that point in time, and we're more in that fixed length of stay mindset. And then as time went on, I would say probably about 2012, 2013, we started to establish more and more contracts with our payers. But we kept that same fixed length of stay mindset. We kept kind of an adversarial relationship with our payers with regards to, we think you need this, but they think you need this, or they're recommending transition to next level of care. And we really realized that that wasn't working for us. It was not creating a positive experience for our patients. It was not creating a positive experience for our clinicians. And it surely wasn't creating a positive experience for our payers. So we really wanted to really shift our focus to view our payers as a customer and figure out, how do we work in tandem? How do we work together? How do we speak the same language to be able to better that relationship and improve that overall patient experience? We can move to the next slide. So that took a lot of preparation on our part. And part of that was really looking at what works. Where were outcomes at that point in time? Where was the area to focus? And we took an opportunity to look at ourselves and make a huge transition from an organizational standpoint to move away from that fixed length of stay, residential focused mindset to really understand the importance and the benefit in engagement through various levels of care over varying amount of times, and really individualizing the patient experience. This is feedback that we got from our payers, looking at behavioral-based milestones and really understanding what does this person need for this amount of time. It also helped us look at how we do transitions and look at refining the process for patients that were moving from one level of care to the next, and helping that overall experience throughout the full continuum of service. We had to get really uncomfortable with being comfortable with being uncomfortable. We had to have a lot of really difficult conversations with our payers to talk about what was working and what wasn't, and be able to understand what is value to them and how do we work together to best serve our patient and their member and deliver on really great outcomes. So it was a lot of asking questions. It was a lot of hearing feedback that wasn't always easy to hear, but it gave us the opportunity to be able to grow, to move forward, to shift our focus, and really to work together in alignment to be able to provide that supportive experience that's going to help drive long-term outcomes. We can move to the next slide. So we've started to have some of the conversations at this point with our payers around what are those expectations? What are you looking for? Hearing that feedback. Now it's looking at more formally, how do we start that value conversation? How do we look at bringing value into our agreements to really show that we are committed to making these changes and really driving the outcomes on the provider side? So some of those conversations are really looking at getting a good understanding of what's going to be of the most value to the payer and to the patient. And then looking at how are we going to start gathering that information? Where is it going to come from? How are we going to report out on that? What does it look like? It took about a year, in some instances a little longer, to be able to establish a baseline and really understand where are we today, so that we had the opportunity to set those goals for the next year. And we wanted to make sure that those goals were reasonable, but we also wanted to push ourselves to do better and to really show that there is continued improvement in the systems and in the care delivery models that we were doing across the board. So it's been a really nice process with our value-based contracts, is that we measure ourselves against ourselves. We know where we were, we know where we want to be, and then we get to see the opportunity and see on paper the work that we've done, which is usually a really great experience. And then additionally, you want to talk about how often do you want to have conversations about value? How often are you running measurements? How often are we meeting together? How do we work together to course correct if something isn't going as anticipated? How can we support one another? One of the things that I've found to be incredibly valuable with the payers that we have worked with is that they're really invested in the success of the patient and in our success in regards to being able to drive those metrics. So figuring out how do we have those conversations and really setting a good rhythm and a good pace and working together. We can go to the next slide. So then just taking a really high level look at how do you put this into action, or how do you put it together from a financial perspective? And what we've really found to be the best options are looking at either an end of the year bonus payment or shared savings pool, which would be determined based on how you do on your scoring for the year, or looking at a portion of our percentage increase for the year being dependent on scoring in those measurements. So really being able to say, okay, we understand the value behind doing this work, and we really want to make sure that we're putting forth a good commitment and a good effort to be able to meet those measures and those metrics, knowing that the success of the program is going to be success on both ends for us and for our payer. As I'm sure you can imagine, a lot of this is based off of claims data. So typically that scoring happens at the end of Q1 when we've got all of the claims rolled in, get the scorecards figured out, and then we would either receive the bonus payment or the percentage increase at that point in time. We can go to the next slide. Then I wanted to also just share a really high level look at some of the measures and the metrics that we have found to be most common and most successful in the value-based agreements that we work within. And a lot of them are tied to HEDIS measures. If you're familiar with insurance, you know HEDIS probably very well. So we're looking at readmission rates at 30, 60, and 90 days to higher level of care. And then also ambulatory follow-up appointments at 7 and 30 days post-discharge. We've really found that the higher our ambulatory discharge rates are, that people are following up with ongoing care, the lower our readmission rates tend to be. Those two play off of each other nicely. Some other areas is individualized length of stay and looking at that average length of stay in all different various levels of care. And then also looking at patient perception of care, which we measure through our Press Ganey surveys. So I will move to the next slide and hand it over to Donna.
Thank you, Ashley. Some really good points you point out in your slides, and I'm sure we'll get into them during the dialogue later. Just a little bit about myself. If you haven't read a preview, I have over 20 years in healthcare leadership experience, predominantly in value-based care. Most of that is on the payer side, so I've built some of the most well-known alternative payment models that are out there today, predominantly in physical health, but I also have some exposure to behavioral health. As you can see on the screen, I've held 2 roles in behavioral health on the payer side. One was the VP of Value-Based Solutions for an integrated health system or integrated payer system, one being Mercy Care Plan, which is the physical, and Mercy Maricopa, which is the behavioral health under one roof. When you have that under one roof component, you can share data pretty easily. So a lot of exciting, innovative work was done there. Also, my most recent role was the Senior Director of Provider Reimbursement for Magellan, and my primary role there was to design value-based care alternative payment models. I was responsible for the rate increase budgets and moving our organization from fee-for-service to fee-for-value, which is moving incentives from your rate increase budget or your rate increases to more of an incentive alternative payment model. So without further ado, I do value-based care consulting. So there's some contact information there on the bottom right. Just a little plug. We can advance the slide. So what do we need to know about value-based care contracting? And I think it's really important. You know, I've done a lot of public speaking over the years, and it's interesting to see or to hear that you'll have such a wide, varied response to what is your knowledge base of value-based care on a scale of 1 to 10. And I'll get some individuals that will say, I know value-based care very well, I'm an 8 or a 9. And then the response I get back is more along the lines of group purchasing. And group purchasing is entirely different from value-based care. Value-based care is more about moving, I say in layman's terms to some of the people that I talk to, is it's paying a provider to get you well rather than to see you. It's moving from fee for service, just treat you, to getting you well or getting you better and paying for those outcomes. And when we think about that, we think about the quadruple aim. And what is the quadruple aim? For those of you who haven't heard it, it's the foundation behind value-based care. CMS actually hired a third-party entity called CPR, Catalyst for Payment Reform. CPR designed LAN, which is the Learning Action Network. It's a LAN framework for rising risk. And in summary, it's just basically a stepping stone to get providers ready for rising risk in baby steps. So moving you from a very simple model, keeping your fee-for-service payments, and dipping your toe into some sort of risk or incentive that is upside only. Upside means that you only get paid when you perform well. And then the LAN framework progresses to a heavier load of risk where there could potentially be downside, where if you don't perform well, you're actually paying money. But if you can imagine, just as in the stock market, the more risk you take, the more rewards that are returned. So there's definitely advantages to getting to the higher level of risk, but you have to get ready for that. Why should you be eager to negotiate a value-based care contract? Of course, the quadruple aim focuses on the 4 components being improving quality, lowering the total cost of care, improving the patient experience, and now the 4th one, which used to be the triple aim, but now it's the 4th, it actually considers the providers out there and ensuring that we minimize provider burnout. So it's provider satisfaction as well. With that said, as providers or provider organizations, the quadruple aim should be very important to you in your organization. It will help you expand your market share, your growth, sustainability in the market. It will increase your reimbursements if you perform well and you know how to play the game well. It will increase your profits. And of course, regulatory and compliance requirements will require you to do so. If it's not already in your market, it's coming. It's already implemented, for most of you may know, in physical health. It's moving into behavioral health. Am I ready to take on risk? Again, talking about the upside and downside considerations and gradually getting there, limiting your exposure when you negotiate in a value-based care arrangement, something that is very important. There are cash flow negotiation tactics that you can employ, and thinking about that, because there are resource requirements to implement a value-based care initiative to ensure that you improve on that performance. So some things to consider, but they're also, as along the land framework, you can take baby steps, so you don't necessarily need a ton of resources. Next slide. Oh, the current landscape. So the current landscape today, when value-based care first came out, it was going between payer and provider. Now we have everybody is playing in the sandbox. We have value-based care arrangements going in every direction, and the diagram on the left highlights that for you. So what my point is on this slide is that it's really important to know who your customer is. Your customer, as Ashley mentioned earlier, isn't just the patient, isn't just making sure that your care delivery plan is meeting the needs of the patient. It's ensuring that you're playing well, or you're understanding what your client's needs are, which is the payer. So in this instance, I think it's important for you to know that the payer has incentives as well, who they have as a customer or client, I should say, and that's the regulatory forum. So we have performance guarantees on HEDIS measures, and we would trickle down those HEDIS measure incentives to, as Ashley mentioned earlier, to the provider group. So understanding what the motivators are behind the payer and utilization, cost of care, patient outcomes, those are really important. There's some regulatory and compliance requirements that are really important for you to know that we'll talk a little bit about. Data access, knowing how you can leverage the data that you have that the payer does not have and is very interested in, and knowing the limitations of the data that the payer has is important too. We'll talk a little bit about measure and model design and some of those key components that you see there. But if we can advance to the next slide. Negotiation strategies. In here, I think it's important to talk about optimizing the engagement level by aligning with the off-the-shelf products that a payer may have. So a payer that has a footprint in value-based care already today, they have off-the-shelf products that they can simply employ with mostly large provider groups. That's because there is enough ROI with the resources that would be required to employ that value-based care model. But there is opportunity outside of the off-the-shelf products. I want you to think about being an innovative partner. And when I talked about in the slide earlier, what motivates a payer are filling gaps that they need to fill, such as where we don't have standardized measures today. If you have an opportunity to build or design standardized measures in collaboration with a payer through self-reported data, that's a great opportunity to design something innovative, begin a pilot and a partnership in an area that maybe a payer wouldn't have paid attention to you because you're too small. But in an instance where you're innovative, they potentially would. So that's a little bit more about the negotiation component. And I call those hot buttons. And for those of you who have any sales experience, hot buttons is a sales term that is commonly used, is knowing what your customers' needs or your clients' needs are. And another key point I want to make on this slide is speak their language, meaning speak the language of the payer when you're presenting a proposal or you're negotiating a contract. Payers are data rich and they know data inside and out. If you're negotiating with them, they want to see trends, they want to see baseline, they want to see what have you done in this area in the past. Do you have any case studies, any pilots, anything that has shown your success in this area is going to get their attention. They're data driven and data is king. What else can I point out? There is a link on the negotiate section of this slide that I want you to be aware of. It's a link to a site that can help you stay abreast of regulatory and compliance changes in your market and your specialty. So if we think about, for those of you who may know, SB 855 is limiting payers' ability to manage utilization. If you have that knowledge and you have it under your belt when you're at the negotiating table, you will be in a winning position. So just an example of some opportunities for you out there. Next slide. This is just an example of an innovative I just finished designing in ABA. And in ABA care, most of you know that there are no standardized measures. So this is a provider, I should say, that reached out to me and a few others within the organization that really didn't have a high volume, wasn't a material payer on our bottom line. We didn't have an off-the-shelf product, of course. We didn't have standardized measures. So why would a payer be interested in negotiating this agreement? Well, because there's opportunity behind the scenes. The proposal that was presented, not only were they not large and significant, but the rates were too high. There was no management. There were no minimum thresholds. They were asking for the sky and then some. So it just highlights that there's still opportunity, even if you're a small provider, small organization. If you can hone in on the hot buttons of your your client being the payer, you can get their attention, know how to negotiate, know what's important to them. And in this instance, this was resulted in a press release and is hoping to set standardized measures in ABA care. So I'm pretty excited about that. And that's all. Next slide. Margaret, I believe that's you.
Yep. Thank you so much, both Ashley and Donna. So I do have a few questions just to kind of kick us off a little bit here on the discussion. Monica sent a timely article out this morning, and she was talking about how COVID has really accelerated some of these initiatives that have been on the back burner nationally, whether that be telehealth or some of the other initiatives. So how do you think COVID has impacted value-based contracting in behavioral health? And I'd love to hear from Donna, both you and Ashley, on your perspective of how this has really impacted it.
Yeah. Ashley, if you'd like to go.
Sure, and I want to actually say it's very interesting, the timing of COVID, because we have been working in a value-based contract prior to the pandemic. And one of the areas that we looked at for improvement for the 7 and 30-day follow-up appointments was being able to deliver virtual services at an intensive outpatient level of care. So we did a pilot program with that payer as part of our value-based agreement and coming out of some of the outcome measures to be able to start implementing some virtual services. And we were going to move on to our next state with regards to expansion of the pilot, and then COVID hit. And Hazelden Betty Ford was able, luckily, to shift that very quickly to be able to meet the needs of those virtual services, because we had the opportunity to pilot the way that we do virtual work previous to the pandemic hitting, which doesn't mean it didn't have its challenges. However, I think that the work that we did in our value-based program with that particular payer helped get us above the curve or ahead of the 8 ball there, kind of unknowingly so. We had no idea that that was going to shift as quickly as it did. But it is a really nice play, I think, Donna, to your point around how do you pilot programs and how do you work together to be able to think creatively to fill that gap or to provide a solution to a service line that may be missing or to reach a population that may not be able to get into care for one reason or another. The virtual services are so huge with social determinants of health and those that struggle with transportation to and from programming, those who have issues with childcare, or maybe there are other commute reasons, things to that effect, that folks may not be able to get into service. So being able to take all of those things into consideration, I think that has been a blessing in disguise from COVID from our vantage point. And Donna, I'll let you answer from your perspective.
Thank you. You know, it's so interesting how shy the public was to telehealth in behavioral health prior to COVID, right? No way, I could never do that. And now it's a blessing, to your point, Ashley. You know, I come from both sides of the fence. Like I said, physical is where I got my first experience and most of my experience in value-based care. But I also have that exposure to behavioral health, and it's in physical health. Telehealth is absolutely an opportunity, and it's just like everything else in value-based care. It's further along in physical, but in behavioral health, I have this one statistic I have to read, and it's estimated that 41% of U.S. adults reported having avoided or delayed medical care during the pandemic, and that includes 12% who avoided urgent or emergency care. So when you think about that, you know, that has a trickle down effect to when you're avoiding your physical health, that affects your behavior, your mental state, and it's vice versa as well. When you're neglecting your mental care, your physical health deteriorates. So it's so important, and I'm so glad to see that telehealth has really been well received, both from the payer and not only the payer, but the provider and the patient. The patient is so much more accepting of telehealth now. In being in that position that I was in recently with Magellan during the COVID crisis, I was able to see some pretty interesting creative stuff happening in telehealth. So value-based care absolutely has a footprint in telehealth now, and we can try and look at some of the positives that have come out of this and know that for those members who are rural, who have challenges in getting care, whether that be economic or social status, whatever the case may be, or maybe they're just reluctant to travel to go to a doctor for whatever reason. That's now, we're breaking down those barriers, and value-based care, you know, I've seen some of the most innovative things come out of increasing the 7-day and 30-day follow-up that you mentioned, Ashley, when it comes to telehealth. You know, iPads are being brought right into an inpatient setting so that members can schedule their 7-day and 30-day follow-up right then and there. And the incentives are just spreading like a network of electricity. They're going in every direction. If the hospital helps, if the inpatient setting helps, if the primary care helps, if the behavioral health provider helps, everyone who can help make that happen, they're all getting a piece of this pot, a pool of money. And it's just amazing to see the innovation that's happening as a result.
Great, great. Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about the collaboration between the payer groups and the provider groups. So how would you recommend that a provider group best align or figure out what's the most important for the payer group? I mean, there has to be some collaboration there. There has to be a meeting of the minds. So talk to me a little bit about the tactics or the nitty gritty of how we get down to making that decision and really working together to figure out what's the payer's level of interest on this, what are some of the measures that we are going to agree upon. So kind of talk a little bit about that.
Ashley, you do well when you go first. I do better when you go first.
All right, I can go first then. From our vantage point, it was getting to know our provider relations folks at the payer group and getting introduced to the people that are on our contracting team and really going out of our way to take the time and start having those conversations. And like I had mentioned before with some of the slides, it was asking some tough questions around where do you see our gaps and where do you feel that we can support you differently and how do we really work together, and being prepared to hear what those answers are and being ready to make some changes to be able to meet those needs. I think that one of the things that's most important is being able to show your ability to be flexible and your ability to think outside of the box in order to demonstrate that you understand those pieces that are going to be of the most value to them, and then working together and collaborating around how that looks. I think one of the things that we found to be really successful is having contacts in various levels at various points. So maybe that's getting connected with their clinical group and being able to talk about what are we doing from a clinical standpoint. It may be talking about some of the work that we're doing with peer support or additional services that help improve those long-term outcomes or recovery management. So being able to have various levels of conversation in various contexts to really show that flexibility and to be able to think on your feet in regards to saying, okay, these are the needs that were identified. Now, how do we work together to be able to fill that gap, or how do we work together to be able to meet that need? Not saying that there's going to be an answer to every question or that there's going to be something to fill every single void. However, being able to have open and honest conversation around if we can't do something, this is why, and this is how we can look towards doing that in the future. So maybe we focus on this area instead. So being able to really just have open dialogue, I think, has been incredibly important for us.
Yeah,
Right.
I
And I think, with all the technology we have around us, what I'm taking from what you're saying is the old-fashioned build your relationships. Don't be afraid to ask, what are we doing wrong? And that comes from both sides. And how could we do this better? I mean, really, that's what I'm taking, just globally from what you're saying. So Donna, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. Some things that I've seen in my position with Magellan have been ensuring that the value proposition is brought to the conversation. You can get your foot in the door with your contracting rep, perhaps, but when you do get that first meeting with the higher level executives within the payer group or the payer organization, it's important that your presentation has dollar figures, right? So you don't want to be too vague, too high level in your first meeting because you will likely not get a second. Resources are not plentiful on the payer side either. They will likely only meet with you or continue to meet with you if it's progressing. So to Ashley's point, be collaborative, be willing to have those tough conversations as early as the first meeting. Know what it is that you're looking for, what you're asking for. And if you don't, ask those tough questions so that you understand the motivation behind the payer. Transparency, when I think about that one example I gave in my last slide, that small time provider group who came to me with a pilot that the rates were crazy, there was nothing there that had anything except I had no standardized measures in ABA care. And wow, I have a partner who's willing to give me any data that would help make this move along, was willing to create something different, new, and was extremely flexible. I worked on that for almost 8 months. We went back and forth and designed something that we're really proud of. So it's making sure that you come to the table with numbers, with data, with validation. Perhaps you have pilots again or case studies. That's going to keep the attention up.
Okay, great. All right, so I am full of questions, but I know our audience probably is as well. So Corey, do we have any questions?
Thanks, Margaret. We do. We have 2 questions. I will read them both, but you can ask me to repeat one if you like. The first is, if the payer has not been in the market before, particularly in Medicaid, where would they pull data from the front end? And the second question is there a value-based primer, a book, website, et cetera, that I could recommend to my organization's leadership team to begin to understanding the way this is operating?
So
Donna, you or Ashley want to take the first one?
And I'm probably going to let you take that, just having more experience from the payer side. I don't know that I would have as good a line of sight into that from my vantage.
yeah, and could you repeat that first one, Corey?
Absolutely. If the payer has not been in the market before, particularly in Medicaid, where would they pull data from the front end?
You know, I can't, I don't know that I can answer that. I'm going to be completely honest. That's not been my area. Where they can pull experience, the data from Medicaid. Typically, from my knowledge, when you get the contract, managed Medicaid contract, you get 2 years of claims history on that panel, on the members within that are assigned to the payer organization that won the contract, if you will. So you get that claims experience sent to you. I don't know that there would be any other data that you could look for, perhaps lab data, but even then you might even get that from CMS. I'm pretty certain that you would get that as well. If not, the lab space will absolutely, or the lab organization, there's value-based care opportunities in lab as well. So data sharing isn't, there's so much to be done with lab data as well. So hopefully that answered the question.
And the second question, Corey?
Yes, is there a value-based primer that our attendee could recommend to her organization's leadership team?
Value-based care, I didn't catch that word.
Some type of product, like a website or a book or resources for the senior leadership to go to kind of, from the payer or the provider side. I don't know which one that's coming from.
Yeah.
Open minds. We get a lot of content from you all. To be perfectly honest, I mean, that's some of the work that my team really looks at, is the articles that are coming out and some of the conversations similar to this, to understand what other programs are doing from a best practices perspective. So I'm going to put a plug in for you all with Open Minds. I think that you do great work.
CMS has a lot of information on value-based care, because if you can imagine, they kind of set standards for commercial employer markets and others, other lines of business for value-based care. Of course, there's more regulatory requirements, so it's not as innovative. But in the commercial space, they take what CMS begins with, it starts foundation on, and they grow it, and it becomes something even bigger and greater typically. So you can go on the websites for the payers. They'll typically have white papers perhaps, or information on it. CMS is a great place to start. You can even type in Google, if you will, for a value-based care. There's so much out there. There really is. Or you can reach out to me. I do consulting.
You know, so, some of the other ones, IHI, NCQA, there's also some, gosh, I'm blanking on. Corey, we might be able to just get a list of resources together, because I'm blanking on some of the other kind of normal sites I go to look up some of the information on value-based. So that might be good if we could get just a resource list together.
For behavioral health, it's a little unique, of course. So I would traditionally say, well, you can go to HFMA or other like ASCO or others, but that's in physical health. In behavioral health, of course, Open Minds would be a good opportunity or a good place to go.
Correct. Okay, Corey, any other questions from the audience?
Absolutely. They're coming in fast and furious now.
Yeah.
Next question. If a provider is unable to get the attention or the audience of a payer to collaborate, will they be defaulted to a standard value-based care contract?
Potentially, yes. That's why I say go to that link that I put in my deck that shows what it could potentially be a negotiating opportunity for you, because you'll understand what the regulatory and compliance requirements are in your market, in your specialty, which you can be, you can have a seat at the negotiating table, perhaps, if you understood what that was. Also, yes, they could potentially employ moving you from a fee for service into a fee for value, and your options are to walk, or you can leverage that and be a top performer. And when you do perform well, there's bigger and greater opportunities for you with that payer. So it makes sense. It's not something that I want you to shy away from or be intimidated by, because there's so much opportunity for growth and financial gain, as well as improved patient outcomes. So.
And Donna, I think that's a really good talking point around the fact that as you start to deliver on the value and you start to understand what that looks like and how your organization fits into that model, it can give you a stronger voice at the table if you're meeting those measures and you're meeting those metrics. So that maybe your initial year is going to be kind of what was handed to you. However, then you can go back and say, okay, well, we're doing all these things. So let's talk. Let's sit down. Let's have this conversation and be able to look at how do we do this differently in a way that's going to provide a better experience overall for all of the players at the table.
Yeah, and to add on to that, if you cannot get the attention of a payer and you have a care delivery plan that you feel very strongly about, take 6 to 12 months to build trends and outcomes in that, and devise a case study that you can go to get the attention of that payer, whereas prior you didn't have that. So there was nothing for them to grab onto. You weren't high volume, weren't high cost, there was no opportunity there. And you weren't willing to take their off-the-shelf product, perhaps. There are multiple reasons. That's something that proves that you've improved in outcomes and or lowered costs. They want to know, they want to hear that, they're interested. They want not only to focus on the quadruple aim, but they're also interested in looking good in the eyes of their client, either be RFPs with the state organizations or their physical payers where they're a carve out. So they want to look good to, let's say, Blue Cross Blue Shield or the Humana, the Cignas, the Aetnas out there, because they want the behavioral health carve outs. They want that business. So they want to say, look at this pilot that I did in ABA care, where we know we're struggling to lower costs because there's no endpoint in care, but yet we have improved outcomes. How could you do that? How did you build standardized measures? Are they well vetted by your peers? Well, yes, they are. So they get the publicity through press release, and there's value there. And they take that and they win more business with it. So just thinking outside the box.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point, Donna, is that we can all come together and ask what we can do better. We can get on the same path. But when it comes to the payer's point of view, it really is bringing more data is much better. Bringing data that your programs work. So don't be afraid to do that and then go back to the payer. I wouldn't just say that you can't get their attention one time, then don't try again, continue to try. especially if you have some great outcomes. Corey, we got about 15 minutes left, so do we have some more questions?
Absolutely. We've had one come in directed at Ashley. It says, could Ashley describe the process of negotiating quote unquote reasonable goals with the payer?
Great question.
That's a really good question. So one of the things that has been really interesting and a huge learning curve for us is being able to look at the benchmark data. And it takes a lot of time for us to sit down with the payer looking at the benchmark to really understand what that is before we even want to have any conversations around setting the goals. We want to know what measures are they looking at, where are they pulling the claims data from, what membership group are they looking at. Sometimes they're looking at just fully insured, sometimes they're looking at full book of business. So really getting a good solid understanding of where the baseline measurements are coming from. And when we talk about those stretch goals, we usually look at, okay, we look 1 year back and then we look at, okay, how about 2 years back? So what did we see from 2019 to 2020 in regards to performance outcomes? Where was the growth in that space? How did we do? And then set a baseline around that to be able to understand, okay, maybe we had a 1% improvement, or maybe we had a 2% improvement, and using that as our baseline moving forward. One of the other areas that we learned pretty quickly is, so I had talked about the fact that we use patient satisfaction in one of our agreements. And that data is driven from our Press Ganey surveys, which are discharge surveys for all of our clients that are leaving care. Well, the way that we had it established, you can only hit such a number. So initially we want to see a 1% increase. Well, when you're in the 99th percentile for scores, you don't have room to go up any farther. So we actually ended up having to go in and rewrite that goal because we had almost like hit a cap in regards to how that measurement looked or how that worked. One of the things is we approach it with a collaborative mindset and understanding, you know, some of the market data too. So technically our goals we're measured against ourselves, but we also want to understand the market in each of those areas to see how other providers are doing, to understand what is a realistic growth goal. So not just relying on our data, but also looking at, okay, maybe I'll use Florida as an example. Can we see, without names, some of the work that your other payers are doing in the value-based space, what their improvement levels are, what their total percentages are, so that we know what seems to be realistic from a goal setting standpoint. And I hope that answered the question.
Okay. Thank you. Corey?
Thanks, Ashley. We've had another question come in. In behavioral health, how do you ensure adverse selection of patients do not occur when value-based arrangements are in place? What is your experience with risk adjustment? Is it better to risk adjust scores or risk adjust payments, especially when you have a population with health disparities and complex social determinants of health needs?
That's a great question.
That is a big question. I'm going to let Donna go first on this one.
You know, this is so much easier in physical health to risk adjust numbers because they're assigned, if you will, to a PCP, or we can at least establish through claims history where the member should be attributed to. In behavioral health, we're taking baby steps towards getting that attribution so that we could identify, you know, a potential risk score for that member and ensure that there is no adverse selection through APM design, alternative payment model. So it's how you design the measures and how you structure the financial model to ensure that there's no adverse selection. So, you know, gosh, I did something very similar. I can't think of an example, but you know, you think about opioids and ensuring that, I'm going to come up with something that probably doesn't make sense, but, you know, making sure that any member that comes across to a PCP who has signs or symptoms of opioid addiction, that the protocol for transferring, or I should say referring that member to a behavioral health provider is done so for all members, and all members are given this social determinant of health questionnaire, and there's no adverse selection. Every member or every patient that comes into that PCP, they have to ask the same questions. And how do you do that when you're one payer and they service a patient panel that covers 8 different payers out there? So it's very challenging, to say the least, and it's even more challenging in behavioral health. So to answer your question, would you risk adjust the scores for the patients or the members, or would you risk adjust the payments? And I think that really depends. It really depends on the percent of the patient population that you as a payer covers for that provider. So if you're a predominant portion of that patient panel, then you can cover a significant portion of the patients that the provider sees and make a greater impact. However, there's also strategies for risk adjusting into the alternative payment model. That makes sense.
Ashley, any thoughts on, do you currently do any risk adjustment with for your pay for performance?
We do have some outlier thresholds written into some of the agreements with regards to total cost of care, but it's not something that is commonly used in most of the agreements that we have in place at the moment. It's not, as Donna said, it's a really complicated process to be able to pull together and to really understand what those benchmarks would look like. Gets to be a more difficult measurement task, I think, than most providers would have access to from a planning perspective.
There are outliers when you look at case rates, things of that nature, but it's really not, I don't consider that risk adjusting.
Yeah. So, pretty much behavioral health is still trying to figure it out. It's on the table where we're looking at it, providers are looking at it, payers are looking at it, but we just haven't figured it out yet, pretty much. Is that correct?
Well, it is a little bit more challenging, we're dipping our toes into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Not that we can't figure it out, it's just, it really is new, yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Corey, do we have one maybe quick question? I'd love to sneak another one in before we have to leave.
Absolutely, thank you guys. How have you seen the staffing crisis impact value-based contracting? The ones that we have been involved in require consistent staffing levels, which is challenging in this climate.
Probably you, Ashley. Yeah, I don't that I would add much on that one.
That's a really interesting question, because I think that some of that impact is more indirect rather than direct when we're looking at our value-based contracting and how that plays in. We have been very fortunate with regards to some of our access with medical records and things to that effect that are driving some of those benchmarks or metrics. And I believe from a clinician standpoint, that shift to virtual services and changes in staffing and transitions and things around that nature, I don't know that I can say that I've seen a real direct impact. I have had some conversations with payers as of recently who are driving data to us that have struggled being a specialty provider and the size of our organization to say, we don't have the manpower to be able to drive you the value-based reimbursement measures as often as you would like. I would say that's one of the challenges that we've run into, is being able to get access to some of the same data that we would otherwise have had in the relationships that we built with our payers. And then really looking at that value of being able to say, okay, these measures are driving financial outcomes from the payer side of things, to say that it's worth the time and the investment and the energy to be able to get all the information together and to be able to continue having those conversations around where the data points are falling and how we're doing.
Okay, great, thank you. Corey, maybe one more, just one?
Yeah, we got a couple minutes. We just had one comment. It says, what % of total revenue would a provider who is just getting started expect to have in value-based contracting?
Woo. Great,
Just getting started, it's a key.
yeah.
I think that's going to be dependent on your size and the work that you're doing with the payers and how those negotiations and processes go. So what we tend to do when we are driving the like bonus type payments, it may be anywhere from like 0.5% to 2%, depending on the payer group. When you're looking at increases year over year on your contract, so maybe you say that you have a set annual increase in place, you may look at adding a couple additional % for the value in addition to what you have negotiated for your fee for service increase. So it just kind of depends on the methodology that you go with and the size of the organization, and then also the size of the payer that you're working with and their willingness to be able to negotiate in that area. And Donna, I don't know if you want to share more from your advantage or experience.
I agree. I don't know that I can speak from a provider's perspective and how much revenue they should put into their value-based care bucket as a new start up or just getting their feet wet into value-based care. I would agree it should be small in the single digits as far as percent. It shouldn't be large. And it absolutely depends on how large that organization is. So how financially sound is that organization? But it's depend on, if you're negotiating a value-based care arrangement with 50% of your revenue and that is upside only, and it's based upon operational processes and initiatives that are already in play, why wouldn't you? It's upside only. You're already, you're tracking towards or trending towards improving or meeting that performance guarantee already. There's so many factors that could play into how much you should put into that, because I don't see that as risk, right? It's upside only. It's above and beyond what you're getting today. You're already operationalizing these initiatives for other reasons, perhaps, or the lift to do so is minimal in comparison to the upside opportunity. So I would say it could absolutely be more, but without understanding all the factors involved.
So it really depends on a lot of different factors, from the payer to the provider organization, where they are, and but it's okay to start out small and build.
Yeah, it's okay. That's what the land framework was designed for.
Exactly. Great. Super. Okay, Corey, we got about 3 minutes left.
Thanks, Margaret. Let's get one more question in here. And I apologize to anybody who sent a question in that we did not get to. We will look at those afterwards and reach out to you individually. Question is, we are looking for a new EHR system that is fully integrated with the billing system. You have a recommendation with a system that will help provide the data desired for value-based data reporting.
If you figure out the answer to that question, if you can give me a ring and let me know, that would be lovely.
Yeah.
We do pretty well within our EHR, but I think that any product that you go into there's gaps. And the more that you can talk with that electronic health record provider, I think you ask a lot of questions right up front as you're trying to navigate who you want to go through, and talk with them about all of those different components. How do you do data? How does your billing integration work? How do you do your clinical documentation? Do the systems talk to one another? How does that look? And just ask a ton of questions. And like I said, if you find a magic solution, please give me a ring.
I will add I'd be very interested to better understand what data is that vendor capturing in behavioral health. because there are more vendors out there than anyone can count on physical health, but behavioral health, I don't know of many, if any, honestly, and maybe it's just my ignorance because I'm on the payer side, but I would be very interested to know what data they're capturing because it should align with your value-based care arrangements or the arrangements that you're looking to partake in. If you're looking to be innovative and capture data so that you can build that pilot, that magic pilot I was talking about, that will get your foot in the door with a payer, then making sure that it's agile, the system is agile so that it can be tweaked to meet the needs of your negotiating strategy.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, Corey, we're out of time. So sad.
Thank you, Margaret, Ashley, Donna, thank you very much. This has been great. Before we go, I just want to take a moment to once again thank our sponsors, Qualifax Plus Credible, and to remind everybody that we are here every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Next week, Sharon Hicks, Senior Associate for Open Minds, will discuss how to integrate social determinant supports into your existing clinical programs. Once again, thank you, everybody. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you all who
Thank
attended.
you.
Thank you, Corey.